Have you ever stood in the quiet of a starless night and felt the immense weight of the universe pressing down, whispering a question that has haunted humanity since the dawn of thought? It is a question etched into the heart of our existence, a paradox that challenges the very foundations of justice and faith. Why do the righteous suffer? Why do the hands that sow kindness reap thorns, while those that plant discord harvest fields of gold? Why, in our moments of deepest despair, does the silence from the heavens feel so absolute, so deafening? This is not a new riddle. It is an ancient ache, a profound mystery whose threads are woven into the very fabric of the sacred texts. And within those pages lies the story of a man whose life became the ultimate crucible for faith, a tale that echoes through millennia. The story of Job. In the heart of a land cradled between the unforgiving crimson peaks and the vast, shimmering salt flats, there was a lush, emerald expanse known as the Viridian Valley of Uz. This was no barren desert. It was a paradise on earth, fed by a silver ribbon of a river that brought life and abundance. And at the center of this prosperity lived a man named Job. He was not a king robed in purple, nor a prophet whose voice shook nations. He was a man of the earth, yet his soul reached for the heavens. His integrity was as solid and unyielding as the mountains that watched over his valley. His reverence for God was not a garment worn for public display, but the very air he breathed, a quiet, powerful force that shaped his every action and turned him from the faintest shadow of evil. In all the lands, from the eastern sea to the western sands, there was no one so blameless, so utterly upright. But Job's righteousness was not the piety of a pauper. He was a man of staggering abundance. His wealth was not counted in coins, but in life itself. The lowing of 1,000 prize oxen and 500 she-donkeys was the morning symphony on his lands. The bleating of 7,000 sheep, their fleece as white as the snows on the crimson peaks, echoed across his pastures. A legion of loyal servants, more than 3,000 strong, tended to his household and his fields, their own families flourishing under his generous and just hand. The scent of spices and baked bread perpetually hung in the air around his great house, a testament to a prosperity so vast it became legendary. He was, without dispute, the greatest man in all the East. Yet, for all this earthly treasure, Job's most precious jewels were his 10 children. 7 sons, strong and sharp-witted, and 3 daughters, whose beauty was said to rival the desert dawn, were the light of his life. They were a tapestry of joy, their lives woven together with laughter and love. They would hold magnificent feasts, rotating between their homes, celebrating the simple, profound gift of being a family, of sharing the bounty God had so richly bestowed upon them. Job would watch them, his heart swelling with a love so fierce it was almost painful, a perfect picture of a life blessed beyond measure. However, beneath the calm surface of this idyllic existence, a current of deep anxiety troubled Job's soul. He did not sleep the untroubled sleep of the complacent. Every morning, while the world was still cloaked in the deep velvet of night, long before the first hint of rose and gold touched the horizon, Job would rise. In the quiet solitude of his courtyard, with the cool stones beneath his bare feet, he would build an altar. With practiced, steady hands, he would light a fire, its flickering flame a lonely beacon against the pre-dawn gloom. One by one, he would offer a burnt offering for each of his children, 10 sacrifices in total, for a secret fear gnawed at him, a thought that coiled in the depths of his heart. Perhaps, he would whisper into the rising smoke, perhaps in their feasting and merriment, one of my children has sinned. Perhaps, in a fleeting moment of thoughtless joy, they have forgotten or even cursed God in their hearts. Job understood a truth that most men, drunk on their own success, fail to grasp. He knew how terrifyingly fragile blessings could be. He knew that all he possessed was not his by right, but a gift, a loan from the Almighty. And so, his daily ritual was not an act of fearful superstition, but a profound expression of love, a desperate, humble intercession to shield his beloved children, to stand in the gap between their potential failings and the perfect holiness of God. But even as the last of the smoke from his sacrifice ascended into the lightning sky, he was being watched, not by a neighbor, not by a spy, but from a realm beyond time and space, a place where his perfect world, so meticulously protected, was about to be put on trial. The heavens parted, not with clouds, but with a shimmering tear in reality, revealing the eternal court. Before a throne that pulsed with the light of 1,000,000,000 suns, the sons of God, the angelic beings woven from starlight and eternity, presented themselves. They were the architects of galaxies, the guardians of cosmic law, their gaze holding the wisdom of ages. And walking among them, a dissonant note in the celestial harmony, was a shadow that did not flee from the light. His steps were unwavering, his presence a cold void in the warmth of creation. It was Satan, the adversary, the wanderer, the accuser, whose restless eyes miss nothing. The voice of the Lord, a sound like the turning of constellations and the rush of mighty waters, echoed through the court, directed at the shadow. "From where have you come?" Satan bowed, a gesture of mock deference, his voice like stones grinding together. "From roaming the earth," he replied, a cynical smile touching his lips, "from walking back and forth on it." And it was true. His gaze had pierced the veil of human hearts. He had seen empires turn to dust, heroes become villains, and the devout trade their souls for a whisper of power or a handful of gold. He had seen faith as brittle as a dried leaf, but there was one light he could not extinguish. The Lord knew this, and his voice now held a note of profound paternal pride. "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him, blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." Emson. The accuser's eyes glinted with the embers of a fallen star. "Does Job fear God for nothing?" He retorted, his words a sharp, cold blade of logic. "Is his piety not a transaction? You have woven an impenetrable hedge of protection around him, a gilded cage of comfort. You have blessed the work of his hands, and his wealth spreads across the land like a flood. His home, his family, his very breath are safeguarded by your power. Everything he touches turns to gold. Are you truly surprised he sings your praises? But I challenge you. Stretch out your hand. Take it all away. Let him taste the bitter dust of ruin. Let the hedge burn. And I promise you this, he will curse you to your face." The challenge hung in the air, a terrible and silent promise. A stillness fell upon the court. The Lord's gaze did not waver. He knew the heart of his servant. "Very well then," his voice thundered, a divine decree that sealed Job's fate. "Everything he has is in your power. But on the man himself, you are not to lay a hand." Permission had been granted. Without another word, the shadow turned and vanished from the celestial court, a chilling whisper of malice left in his wake. The trial had been accepted. Job's perfect world was about to shatter. The day began as any other in the Viridian Valley. The sun climbed over the crimson peaks, casting long, cool shadows across the dew-kissed fields. A gentle breeze rustled through the olive groves, carrying the scent of rich earth and blooming wildflowers. In the distance, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer provided a steady beat to the valley's morning song. It was a day painted with the hues of peace and predictability, a portrait of divine favor. At the grand estate of Job's eldest son, the air was alive with celebration. Laughter spilled from the open windows, a joyous sound that mingled with the melodies of lyres and flutes. The 10 siblings were gathered for their customary feast, their voices a chorus of youthful exuberance, sharing bread, wine, and stories, utterly oblivious to the invisible storm gathering on the horizon. Job, having completed his morning prayers, was overseeing the day's work from the cool, shaded portico of his home. He watched as his powerful oxen, yoked in pairs, carved precise dark furrows into the fertile soil. Herds of donkeys grazed placidly in the meadows, their ears twitching at the sound of buzzing bees. Everything was in its place, a well-oiled machine of prosperity and order, a testament to a life built on diligence and divine blessing. He allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction, a deep sense of gratitude for the serene, beautiful world God had granted him. Then, disaster struck. It did not arrive with a warning rumble, but as a lightning flash of pure chaos. A figure appeared on the horizon, a desperate speck sprinting with an unnatural speed. It was one of his herdsmen, a young man named Micah. He burst into the courtyard, his chest heaving, his face a mask of abject terror. Dust and sweat caked his skin, and his eyes were wide with a horror that seemed to have stolen his breath. He stumbled to his knees before Job, gasping for air. "Master," he choked out, his voice a raw, trembling whisper. "Master, the Sabians, a raiding party. They came from the southern dunes like a whirlwind of death." Job's heart gave a sudden, cold lurch. The Sabians were ruthless desert marauders, known for their swift, brutal attacks. "They swept through the western pastures," Micah continued, his words tumbling over one another. "They took the oxen, all of them, and the donkeys. They slaughtered the other servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." And a chill, sharp as a shard of ice, shot down Job's spine. The oxen, the very symbol of his agricultural strength, gone. But before the full weight of the news could settle, before Job could even form a question, another figure burst through the gates. This was an older shepherd, his face blackened with soot, his tunic smoldering at the edges. He collapsed against a pillar, panting, his eyes reflecting a terror not of this world. "Master Job," he rasped, pointing a trembling finger towards the sky. "Fire! Fire from the heavens! It wasn't lightning, it was a curtain of flame, a storm of living fire that rained down upon the sheepfolds." His voice cracked with disbelief and awe. "Your sheep, 7,000 of them, and the shepherds who watched over them, consumed in an instant. Nothing remains but charred earth and the smell of ruin. Only I escaped. Only I am left to bring you this news." Job could barely breathe. Fire from the sky. Was it a judgment? A celestial sign? The logical, ordered world he inhabited was beginning to fray at the edges, replaced by a surreal nightmare. He felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. His flocks, the source of his vast wealth in wool and trade, incinerated by an act that defied all natural explanation. But the torrent of tragedy was not yet over. A third messenger, a camel driver, staggered into the courtyard, his arm bleeding from a deep gash, his face a canvas of desperation. He nearly fell, catching himself on the doorframe. "Sir, the Chaldeans!" he cried, his voice hoarse. They came in 3 raiding bands from the north, a perfectly coordinated attack. They surrounded the herds, your camels, your entire fleet of the desert. They have been stolen. Your servants fought bravely, but they were all slain by the sword. I hid among the rocks, wounded. I am the only one who escaped." Job felt the ground tilt beneath his feet. It was as if the earth itself was opening up to swallow him. Everything. His legacy, the work of a lifetime, his entire fortune, reduced to dust and ashes in the span of a few heartbeats. The synchronized, multi-pronged attack felt deliberate, malevolent. He clutched the stone railing of the portico, his knuckles white, trying to steady a world that was spinning out of control. But the final, most devastating blow was yet to fall. A fourth man entered. He was the youngest of them, a household servant from his eldest son's home. But this one did not run. He walked slowly, his steps heavy, with a sorrow too profound for haste. He did not shout. The message was not in his voice, but in his facial landscape of utter devastation, his eyes hollowed out by a grief that had no words. He stopped before Job, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Sir," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "your children." Job clung to his seat, a terrifying premonition gripping his heart, squeezing the air from his lungs. His heart began to pound against his ribs like a war drum, a frantic, desperate rhythm. The servant finally looked up, and Job saw in his eyes the reflection of his own shattered world. "Your sons and daughters, they were in the eldest son's house, eating, drinking, celebrating. a great wind, a freak whirlwind came roaring out of the desert. It struck the house, not from one side, but from all four corners at once. The pillars cracked, the roof groaned, and then it collapsed. The young man's body shook with a sob he could no longer contain. They are all gone, my lord, buried in the ruins. Everyone. Only I, who was outside fetching water, escaped to bring you the news. Job heard nothing else. The world went silent. The sounds of the valley, the distant hammer, the rustling leaves, the pounding of his own heart, all of it ceased. The weight of 1,000 sorrows crashed down upon him, pulling him into a darkness deeper and more absolute than death itself. In one single brutal instant, he had lost everything. Every beast, every servant, every coin. But that was nothing. He had lost his future. He had lost his past. He had lost his heart. His entire family, the 10 lights of his life, extinguished in a single breath. Yet, in this abyss of grief, Job did not scream. He did not rail against the heavens or curse the cruel twist of fate. Instead, a strange, solemn calm settled over him. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. With trembling hands, he reached for the collar of his fine linen robe, the symbol of his status and wealth, and tore it from top to bottom. The sound of ripping fabric was the only sound in the crushing silence. Then, with an expression of profound surrender, he took a small, sharp knife from his belt. He lifted it to his head, and with a steady hand, he passed the blade over his scalp. Locks of his thick, dark hair, once a sign of his vitality, fell to the ground, mingling with the dust. It was an act of ultimate mourning, an absolute acknowledgement that his life, his power, his lineage, all of it had been sheared away, reduced to nothing. Then he fell to the ground, not in a collapse of despair, but in a deliberate act of worship. He pressed his face into the dirt, the very earth that had given him everything, and now seemed to have taken it all back. His voice, broken by a grief so immense it could shatter mountains, echoed in the unnatural stillness. "Naked I came from my mother's womb," he whispered to the soil, "and naked I will return." And then, in a declaration that would defy the accuser and resonate through the ages, he lifted his head slightly and spoke the words that would become his greatest victory. "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." He did not understand. He could not comprehend the reason, the justice, the sheer scale of his loss. But in the face of annihilation, instead of turning away from God in anger, he drew closer in surrender. He bowed down and worshipped. He affirmed, in the very teeth of his agony, that everything he ever had was a gift, never his possession. His faith, like a house built not on the sands of circumstance, but on the bedrock of God's sovereignty, had withstood the storm. Satan's first brutal assault had failed. Days bled into a week into a silent, agonizing passage of time. The Viridian Valley, once a place of vibrant life, now seemed to hold its breath. The laughter of Job's children no longer echoed from their homes, which stood like empty, silent tombs. The fields lay fallow, the great house strangely quiet, inhabited only by the ghosts of memory and a grief so thick it felt like a physical presence. Job moved through his days like a phantom, his heart a hollowed-out cavern where sorrow resided. He had performed the heart-wrenching duty of burying his children, his hands laying the stones upon their graves, each one a weight upon his own soul. Yet through it all, his integrity held. He did not sin with his lips. He did not charge God with wrongdoing. His faith, stripped of every external blessing, had proven to be a thing of substance, an anchor in the deepest abyss. But the accuser was not finished. He was a creature of relentless cynicism, convinced that every virtue had a price, every soul a breaking point. Once more, the veil between realms was torn, and the eternal court convened. The sons of God assembled before the incandescent throne, their luminous forms radiating a serene power. And once again, the dark figure of Satan moved among them, his presence an unwelcome chill. The Lord's gaze fell upon him, a look that held both omniscience and a challenge. "From where have you come?" The divine voice, though powerful, held an undertone of what was to come. Satan offered his now familiar, sly smile, bowing slightly as if he held a dark and amusing secret. "From roaming the earth," he said smoothly, "and from walking upon it." The Lord looked at him, seeing past the veneer of nonchalance to the core of his malevolent intent. Satan had thrown his worst at Job, and the man had not buckled. The righteous man of Uz had withstood the hurricane of loss without cursing his maker. God's pride in his servant was evident as he posed the question that was both a statement of fact and a subtle rebuke. "Have you considered my servant Job? He still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason. There is no one like him on earth, a man perfect and upright, who fears God and shuns evil." He emphasized the words, "without any reason," making it clear that Job's righteousness was the very thing being tested, not punished. The Lord's words struck the accuser like a hammer, a public declaration of his failure. Job had triumphed. It was a humiliation. But the adversary, fueled by an ancient enmity, was not one to concede defeat. His eyes, which had held a flicker of amusement, now blazed with a cold, focused fury. He took a step forward, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "Skin for skin," he sneered, the ancient proverb dripping with contempt. "Yes, a man will give all he has for his own life. He has lost his property, his servants, his children. These are external things. Painful losses, to be sure, but they are not him. His own flesh and bone remain untouched. He grieves, but he still breathes the sweet air of life in a healthy body. His faith is easy when his own skin is not at stake." Only the Lord's expression grew stern, his displeasure a palpable force in the celestial court. The angels remained silent, watching the cosmic drama unfold. Satan pressed his advantage, seeing what he believed was the final, undeniable weakness in all of mortal creation. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, a venomous suggestion. "But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and you will see. He will curse you to your face. I guarantee it." When? The challenge was absolute, a direct assault on the deepest level of a man's being. The Lord did not break his gaze. He knew Job's heart, a vessel of faith he himself had helped to form. He knew its depths and its resilience. With a voice that was both a permission and a final, uncrossable boundary, he declared, "He is in your hands, but you must spare his life." A silent, terrible energy pulsed through the court. The accuser had been given his wish. Without wasting a single moment, Satan turned and descended from the heavens, a whirlwind of malice and fury. There were no more riches to destroy, no more children to take. Now, he would strike the man himself. He would turn Job's own body into a prison of unending agony. Within hours, the attack began. It started not as a fever or a chill, but as a deep, relentless itch under Job's skin. At first, he tried to ignore it, dismissing it as a symptom of his grief, his body reacting to the turmoil in his soul. But the itching intensified, spreading with terrifying speed. It became a burning fire, a torment that offered no relief. Then, the sores appeared. Small red welts at first, they erupted into loathsome, festering boils that covered him from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. His skin, once healthy and bronzed by the sun of Uz, became a grotesque landscape of weeping pustules and inflamed flesh. Pain, stark and relentless, enveloped him like a shroud of agony. A burning fever consumed him from within, leaving him weak and shivering. His skin began to peel off in shreds, and the itching was a living creature, burrowing into his flesh, driving him to the brink of madness. He could not walk without his body screaming in protest. He could not lie down, for the pressure on his sores was unbearable. He could not sleep, for his nightmares were simply a continuation of his waking torment. There was no escape. All he could do was leave his empty, echoing house and sit in the dust and ashes outside the city gate, a place reserved for outcasts and the unclean, broken, forgotten, disfigured. He was now a pariah. The man who once sat in the gate as a respected elder, dispensing wisdom and justice, now sat among the refuse, a spectacle of human misery. In his agony, he took a piece of a broken clay pot, a potsherd, and began to scrape himself with it. The sharp edge gave a moment's brutal relief from the maddening itch, but it also tore his raw flesh, opening new wounds, the pain excruciating. Days turned into a blur of suffering. The man who was once the greatest in the East, whose name commanded respect and admiration, was now a mere shadow of his former self. News of his horrific affliction spread like wildfire. He was no longer Job the prosperous, but Job the afflicted. His honor had vanished, consumed by his disease. To the watching world, his condition was a clear sign. This was the finger of God, a divine punishment for some terrible, hidden sin. He was a human wreck, a man being consumed alive by what looked like leprosy, the most dreaded of all diseases. Isolation became his new reality. Friends, neighbors, even the servants who had once revered him, now shunned him. They would cross to the other side of the road to avoid him, whispering behind their hands, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. He was unclean, he was cursed. But one person remained, his wife. Her name is not recorded, but her pain was as real as Job's verse 2. She had stood by his side, a silent witness to the utter demolition of their world. She saw his wealth vanish in a single day. She had wept with him over the graves of their 10 children, and now she saw the man she loved, the strong, vibrant pillar of her life, reduced to a living corpse, moaning in the ashes. Her heart, already broken, was now being ground into dust. She had reached her limit. Her endurance, her faith, her hope had all been eroded away by the relentless tide of sorrow. One evening, as the sun set, casting a blood-red glow over the valley, she approached him. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes holding a wild, desperate light. Her voice, when she spoke, trembled with a toxic blend of love, grief, and bitter despair. "Do you still hold on to your integrity?" she cried, the words tearing from her throat. "Look at you. Look at what your faithfulness has earned you. Curse God and die." This was the final, most intimate blow. The accuser, unable to make Job blaspheme with his own lips, was now using the voice of the one person closest to him, his partner in life and sorrow. It was a temptation born not of malice, but of unbearable pain. Job slowly lifted his heavy head. His eyes, sunken and clouded with agony, met hers. He saw her shattered heart. He understood her despair. He knew she too was broken. But his own faith, tested by fire and flood, did not waver an inch. A deep sigh escaped his cracked lips. "You speak," he replied, his voice a hoarse rasp, like one of the foolish women. There was no anger in his tone, only a profound, weary sadness. She stared at him, stunned into silence by his response. He looked past her, towards the darkening sky. "What?" he continued, the question directed as much to himself as to her. "Shall we accept only good from God and not trouble?" Job's test was no longer just about losing everything. It was about whether his faith could survive when absolutely nothing was left but pain and the memory of loss. And in that moment, Job did not fall. He stood firm, a battered but unbroken fortress, his integrity a solitary light shining in the deepest, most personal darkness. The tale of Job's catastrophic fall from grace spread like a desert wind, a harrowing story whispered in caravansaries and marketplace stalls across the region. The news traveled on the lips of merchants and travelers, growing more dire with each telling, until it reached the ears of 3 men who knew Job not just as a legend of prosperity, but as a friend. These were Eliphaz, the Temanite, a man of venerable age and esteemed wisdom; Bildad the Shuhite, a staunch traditionalist with a firm belief in the old ways; and Zophar the Naamathite, the youngest of the 3, zealous and quick to judge. They were men of stature and intellect, longtime friends and counselors who had often sat with Job, sharing wine and debating the deep questions of life under the stars. When they heard of the calamities, the loss of his wealth, the death of his children, and now this horrifying, flesh-eating disease, they were horrified. It was incomprehensible. This was Job, the pillar of righteousness, the man God himself seemed to favor above all others. A darkness so profound, falling upon a man so good, defied all their understanding of how the world worked. Moved by a shared grief and a deep sense of loyalty, they made a pact. They would drop everything, their businesses, their families, their own comfortable lives, and journey together to the Viridian Valley. Their purpose was simple and noble: to mourn with their friend, to offer him comfort, to sit with him in his sorrow, and try, together, to make sense of the senseless. They traveled for many days, their journey shadowed by a growing sense of dread. They spoke little, each man lost in his own thoughts, trying to prepare himself for what he might find. They imagined Job gaunt with grief, his eyes hollowed by weeping, but still the man they knew wise, dignified even in sorrow. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared them for what they were about to see. As they crested the final hill overlooking the outskirts of Uz, they saw it. The city dump, a place of refuse and filth, where smoke from smoldering trash mingled with the stench of decay. And there, seated among the mounds of ash and broken pottery, was a figure. It was a man, yet barely human. His body was a landscape of raw sores and crusted scabs, his skin torn and weeping. His head was shaved, his posture broken, his eyes lost in an emptiness so vast it seemed to swallow the light. A cloud of flies buzzed around him, and he sat in a stillness that was more terrifying than any scream. The three friends stopped, their breath catching in their throats. They stared, trying to reconcile this wretched creature with the image of their powerful, respected friend. It couldn't be. This ravaged, disfigured being, this shell of a man scraping his oozing flesh with a shard of clay, this couldn't possibly be Job. This wasn't the greatest man in the East, the wise counselor, the prosperous patriarch blessed by God. This man was a living ruin, a shadow being consumed by disease and death. And then, as the figure slowly lifted his head, their eyes met his. In those sunken, pain-filled orbs, they saw a flicker of recognition, and the devastating truth hit them with the force of a physical blow. It was him. Their hearts broke. A wave of collective agony washed over them, so powerful it buckled their knees. The carefully constructed composure they had maintained throughout their journey shattered into a million pieces. Unable to hold back, they raised their voices in a great, heart-wrenching cry. They wept, not with quiet tears, but with loud, guttural sobs of anguish and horror. Their lament was so piercing, so filled with raw pain, that the few servants and travelers who lingered nearby stopped and stared, their own hearts chilled by the sound of such profound grief. Grief consumed them, demanding a physical expression. In a shared, instinctive gesture of mourning, they tore their fine robes, the fabric ripping with a sound that mirrored the tearing of their own souls. But it wasn't enough. Such a catastrophe demanded more than tears and torn garments. With trembling hands, they scooped up handfuls of the dry, grey dust from the ground and flung it into the air, letting it settle over their heads and shoulders. It was an act of profound solidarity, as if by covering themselves in the filth and ashes of the earth, they could somehow enter into their friend's suffering, share a fraction of his unbearable burden. They approached him slowly and sat down on the ground with him, amidst the ashes and the stench. And then there were no words. What can you possibly say to a man in such a bottomless pit of pain? What platitudes could soothe a soul so utterly crushed? What words of comfort could possibly bridge the chasm between their lives and his? "I'm sorry for your loss." The phrase was a mockery in the face of such total annihilation. "You'll get through this?" It was an insult to the sheer finality of his children's graves. "God has a plan?" It sounded like a cruel joke. They understood, in that moment, a truth that transcends all theology and philosophy. The deepest sorrow cannot be touched by words. Sometimes, the only gift you can offer is the gift of silent presence. The only true compassion is to simply be there, to bear witness, to share the silence. And so they sat. For 7 days and 7 nights they sat together in complete, unbroken silence. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar did not speak a word, and neither did Job. The sun rose and set 7 times. The moon waxed in the night sky. The world continued its relentless turning, but in that small circle of shared misery, time stood still. They sat with him as he shivered with fever, as he groaned in his sleep, as he scraped his tormented flesh. They simply sat, their silent presence a testament to a friendship that endured even in the face of unspeakable horror. They believed their silence was an act of kindness, a respectful solace for a grief too great for language. And for 7 days it was. It was a sacred space, a shared vigil in the heart of suffering. But silence, like a dam, can only hold back the flood of human thought and emotion for so long. Beneath the quiet surface, questions were churning, doubts were festering, judgments were beginning to form, and soon the dam would break. The silence would be shattered, and with the torrent of words that would follow, an even greater, more painful challenge would begin for Job. The test of loss was over. The test of theology was about to commence. The silence of 7 days and 7 nights had become a living entity, a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from grief, horror, and unspoken questions. It stretched and strained, growing thinner with each passing hour until it could hold no more. And then it was shattered, not by a word of comfort or a philosophical query, but by a sound that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth, a voice that was both a whisper and a roar. Job opened his mouth. He did not curse God. He did not curse his friends or the fate that had befallen him. He cursed something far more fundamental, far more intimate. With a voice made brittle by agony and a gaze fixed on a distant, desolate horizon, Job cursed the day he was born. He breathed a lament so profound, so filled with the blackness of utter despair, that it seemed to shake both the heavens and the earth. "Let the day of my birth perish," he rasped, the words tearing through the stillness. "And the night that said, 'A man is conceived.' Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let the moment I was drawn from the womb vanish from the scrolls of history." His friends' eyes widened in shock, a collective gasp catching in their throats. They had braced themselves for tears, for questions, for anger at God, perhaps. But this was something else entirely. This was a nihilistic erasure of his own existence. The Job they knew, the man of unshakable faith, the pillar of hope, was gone. In his place was a man whose soul had been hollowed out, leaving only a void. His voice was that of a man with no reason left to go on, a man who saw no purpose, no meaning, no sliver of light in his own being. He didn't ask for answers. He didn't demand justice. He simply wished, with every fiber of his tormented being, that he had never existed at all. His pain knew no pause. His suffering found no respite. "Why did I not die at birth?" he cried, his voice rising in anguish. "Why did I not perish as I came from the womb? Why were there knees to receive me and breasts that I might nurse? For then I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept and been at rest." He longed for the peace of the non-existent, to turn back time and vanish before his first breath, before his heart had ever learned to love the children he now mourned. Yet still he breathed, still he felt, still he was trapped in a body that was a relentless engine of pain, and a life that no longer held any meaning. "Why is light given to him who is in misery?" he lamented, looking at his friends for the first time, his eyes pleading for an answer they could not give, and life to the bitter in soul. "Why allow a man to live who longs for death, but it does not come?" Job's words were not a theological argument. They were the raw, unfiltered cry of a soul being crushed under the weight of existence itself. But death did not come. God did not grant him the release he craved. His chest heaved with each ragged sob. He no longer ate. He no longer slept. He no longer hoped. "For the thing that I greatly feared has come upon me," he concluded, his voice falling to a whisper of dread. I was not in safety, nor did I have rest, nor was I quiet. Yet trouble came. His friends stared at him in stunned silence. The quiet that followed Job's lament was thick and heavy, charged with a new kind of tension. But it did not last long. Eliphaz the Temanite, the eldest of the three, the one most respected for his wisdom and experience, could not hold back any longer. He had listened to his friend's raw suffering, but he could not comprehend it. His mind, ordered and logical, searched for a reason, a cause for this terrible effect. He gazed at Job, this broken man who had once been his mentor, his inspiration, and felt a duty to speak, to guide his friend back to the path of reason. He couldn't remain silent in the face of what he perceived as a dangerous slide into faithless despair. Taking a deep breath, his expression a mixture of pity and stern disapproval, he finally spoke. His voice was soft at first, measured, as if testing the waters. If one attempts a word with you, will you be weary? But who can withhold himself from speaking? He paused, letting the question hang in the air. Behold, he continued, his tone shifting from hesitant to instructive, you have instructed many, and you have strengthened weak hands. Your words have upheld him who was stumbling, and you have made firm the feeble knees. But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. Another pause, this time more pointed. Is not your fear of God your confidence, and the integrity of your ways your hope? His tone was probing, almost accusatory, as if Job himself had forgotten the very principles he once preached. Eliphaz's logic was beginning to surface, a clear, sharp-edged syllogism. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Job's. Reflect now, Job, who that was innocent ever perished, or where were the upright cut off? The other two friends, Bildad and Zophar, watched intently, nodding in silent agreement. The logic was simple, clear, and to them, irrefutable. God is just. God punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous. Therefore, if Job was suffering on such a monumental scale, he must have done something to deserve it. The words were like a poisoned dart. Eliphaz wasn't directly accusing Job of a specific sin, but the implication, the thick cloud of doubt, hung heavy and suffocating in the air. If you are suffering, you must have sown the seeds of that suffering yourself. He pressed on, his voice gaining the confident cadence of a preacher. As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. By the blast of God they perish, and by the breath of his anger they are consumed. The roar of the lion, the voice of the fierce lion, the teeth of the young lions are broken. The old lion perishes for lack of prey, and the cubs of the lioness are scattered. There was a moment of silence, and then his tone shifted again, becoming mystical, his eyes clouding over as if recalling a profound, personal revelation. Now a word was brought to me stealthily. My ear received the whisper of it, he said, leaning in as if sharing a divine secret. In the dead of night, a spirit glided past my face. The hair of my flesh stood up. It stood still, but I could not discern its appearance. A form was before my eyes. There was silence, and then I heard a voice say, "Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be purer than his maker?" Eliphaz's rhetoric was a masterstroke of indirect accusation. If God puts no trust in his holy servants, if he charges his angels with error, he argued, his voice resonating with conviction, how much more those who dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, who are crushed like a moth. He hadn't directly insulted his friend. He hadn't called him a sinner to his face. But he had ensnared him in a web of harsh and unforgiving logic. His words were a carefully constructed cage designed to force a confession. They insinuated that Job, in his former glory, must have harbored a secret pride, a hidden flaw that had blinded him to his own sinfulness. Job, the just man, now sat in ashes, disfigured and destroyed. To Eliphaz, that could only mean one thing: no one is truly blameless before God. And Job's suffering was the undeniable proof of his guilt. The time for silent comfort was over. The time for correction had begun. The air grew thick with unspoken resentment. Eliphaz recoiled, stung by Job's sharp retort, his face a mask of wounded pride. He had offered what he believed was profound, divine wisdom, only to have it thrown back at him as worthless wind. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, Bildad the Shuhite, ever the staunch defender of tradition, decided it was his turn to speak. If Eliphaz's gentle probing had failed, perhaps a more direct, unyielding approach was needed. To Bildad, the situation was not a complex mystery. It was a straightforward equation of sin and consequence. God is just. The innocent do not suffer like this. The conclusion was simple and brutal. With a stern look, his lips set in a thin, disapproving line, he addressed Job. "How long will you speak these things?" he began, his voice devoid of the cautious sympathy Eliphaz had initially shown. "How long will the words of your mouth be a mighty wind? Does God pervert justice, or does the Almighty pervert the right?" Bildad's questions were not questions at all. They were accusations, rhetorical hammers meant to crush Job's defense. He then delivered a blow of breathtaking cruelty, a speculative judgment on the souls of Job's dead children. "If your children sinned against him," Bildad stated with chilling certainty, "he has delivered them into the hand of their transgression." He presented it as an obvious fact, a logical outcome. Their horrific deaths were not a tragedy, they were a just sentence. He was offering a reason for Job's pain, but the reason was a dagger to his heart, desecrating the memory of his beloved children. Having established the guilt of the children, Bildad turned his rigid logic back to Job. He tried to frame his harsh counsel as a message of hope, though his tone carried the heavy weight of judgment. "If you would seek God diligently and make your supplication to the Almighty, if you were pure and upright, surely now he would rouse himself for you and restore your rightful habitation." The implication was a mirror of Eliphaz's. "Your continued suffering is proof of your impurity. Confess, and you will be restored." "Though your beginning was small," Bildad continued, his voice ringing with the hollow confidence of a zealot, "your latter end would be very great. If you return to God, all can be rebuilt." He urged Job to look to the past, to the wisdom of the ancients who, in his view, understood these immutable truths. "Inquire, please, of the former age, and consider the things discovered by their fathers. For we are but of yesterday, and know nothing. Will they not teach you and tell you, and utter words out of their heart?" He then recited ancient proverbs like articles of law. "Can the papyrus grow up without a marsh? Can the reeds flourish without water? While it is yet green and not cut down, it withers before any other plant. Such are the paths of all who forget God. The hope of the godless shall perish." To Bildad, the solution was simple. God does not forsake the righteous, nor does he support the wicked. Those who sow evil will reap it by the breath of God. If Job were truly upright, God would have already restored him. The fact that he was still sitting in ashes, covered in sores, was the only evidence Bildad needed. It was an open and shut case. Acknowledge your fault, and the verdict may be commuted. Job lifted his eyes, a weariness beyond measure, etched into his features. His friends were like vultures, circling what they perceived to be a dying faith, each one taking a turn to tear a piece from him with their sharp beaks of self-assured theology. They kept insisting, relentlessly, that his suffering must be the direct result of his own sins. But Job knew something they, in their certainty, had forgotten. He knew that in the grand, terrifying court of the cosmos, no mortal could truly justify himself before the infinite power of God. "What you say is true," Job conceded with a sigh, his voice raspy. "I know it is so, but how can a man be in the right before God?" He looked past his friends, his gaze turned inward and upward. "He is not a man as I am, that we might come together in court and debate face to face. If I summoned him and he answered me, I would not believe that he was listening to my voice. For he crushes me with a tempest and multiplies my wounds without cause." There, God, to Job, was not the predictable, ledger-keeping deity of his friend's imagination. He was a force of nature, wise and powerful beyond all human comprehension. He stretches out the heavens with his hands, and his wonders are beyond counting. If he passes by me, I do not see him. If he moves on, I cannot perceive him. If he snatches away, who can stop him? Who can say to him, "What are you doing?" Job's voice was filled with a sense of awe and terror. Even if I were righteous, I could not answer him. All I could do is plead for mercy from my judge. His frustration boiled over. He saw injustice everywhere, and his friends insisted God was behind it all. "The world is given into the hand of the wicked," he declared, his voice rising. "He covers the faces of its judges. If it is not God who allows this, then who is it?" The question hung in the air, a direct challenge to their simplistic worldview. A new, terrifying thought began to dawn on Job. Perhaps God had already condemned him without a trial. Why then do I labor in vain? If I wash myself with snow and cleanse my hands with lye, yet you will plunge me into a pit, and my own clothes will abhor me. Finally, his voice broke, the anguish returning with overwhelming force. He cried out, not to his friends, but to the silent God he felt had abandoned him. "My God, I am weary of my life. I will give free utterance to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. I will say to God, do not condemn me, but show me why you contend with me. What have I done to deserve this punishment? Why did you bring me out of the womb? Why did you create me? Only to hunt me like a lion, only to make me suffer." He reached his hands toward the sky, searching for an answer, a sign, a whisper. But there was no voice, no sign, just the heavy, crushing weight of divine silence. If Eliphaz's words had been a wound, and Bildad's a ruthless blow, then the words of Zophar the Naamathite were a dagger thrust deep into Job's heart, twisted with relish. Zophar, the youngest and most impatient of the three, looked at Job with open contempt. To him, this was all an offensive display of arrogance. Job had sinned, he was being punished, and his refusal to admit it was an insult to God's justice. There was no mystery, no room for debate. "Will all this talk go unanswered?" he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And will a man full of talk be vindicated? Will your idle boasting silence men? Will you still insist on your innocence while no one rebukes you?" His eyes flashed with anger. To Zophar, Job wasn't a victim. He was a fool, a blasphemer, refusing to admit his wrongdoing. "Oh, if only God would speak," Zophar declared. "If only he would open his lips against you and reveal to you the secrets of wisdom, for they are twofold in understanding." "Know then," Zophar leaned in, a bitter, cruel smile on his face as he delivered the most cutting line of all, "that God is exacting from you less than your iniquity deserves." The cruelty of the statement was breathtaking. He was telling Job that his unimaginable suffering, the loss of his children, his wealth, his health, was actually an act of mercy, that he deserved even worse. "If you would truly set your heart right," Zophar preached, his message a brutal ultimatum, "if you would stretch out your hands toward him and put away the wickedness in your tent, then you could lift up your face without blemish. You would be secure and fear no more. You would be restored." His message was clear. Humble yourself, acknowledge God's perfect justice, and accept your deserved punishment. But Job was beyond holding back. This time, his response was not just tinged with pain, it was full of righteous fury. He struggled to his feet, his ravaged body trembling with a new strength born of indignation. His face, hardened by suffering, was set like flint. "No doubt you are the people," he looked at them with utter disdain, "and wisdom will die with you. But I have a mind as well as you. I am not inferior to you. Who does not know such things as these?" He scoffed at their simplistic proverbs. "Do you think you have become the spokesman for the Almighty? Will you show partiality for him? Do you think that only you understand the truth?" His patience had finally run out. His friends had judged him, accused him, and treated him like an unrepentant criminal. But he knew his life had been upright. He knew his faithfulness to God was genuine. If he could not find justice or understanding among men, then he would bypass them entirely. He would speak directly to God. He lifted his face to the heavens, his eyes filled with tears of rage and sorrow, and with a trembling voice, he called out to the Almighty, "My God, Though you slay me, yet I will trust in you. But I will argue my ways to your face. Why do you hide your face and treat me as if I am your enemy? If there is any iniquity in me that condemns me, tell me. If I have sinned, show me. If I am guilty, why don't you just forgive me and put an end to this?" The words left his lips with the last of his strength. He had no answers. He saw no justice. But in the midst of it all, one thing remained: his defiant, broken, and unwavering trust in the very God who seemed to be destroying him. He was broken, yet he still believed. He had lost everything but his integrity, and he would take his case to the highest court in the universe. The debate raged on, a cyclical, soul-grinding argument that went nowhere. Job's friends, trapped in their rigid theological boxes, continued to hurl accusations, dressed as wisdom. Job, isolated in his sea of pain, continued to defend his integrity and cry out for an audience with the God who remained silent. He was a man pushed to the very edge of his being, his faith hanging by a single frayed thread. He had argued, he had pleaded, he had demanded justice from a silent universe. His declaration, "Though he slay me, yet I will trust in him," was the last, defiant cry of a heart that refused to let go, even as it was being shattered. And then, something changed. It began subtly. The oppressive, stagnant air began to stir. A gentle breeze, at first a welcome relief, started to pick up speed, whipping dust and ashes into small eddies around the four men. The sky, which had been a clear, indifferent blue, began to darken, not with rain clouds, but with an ominous, swirling grayness. The breeze turned into a powerful wind, howling through the rocks with a mournful, eerie sound. The friends fell silent, clutching their robes, their faces filled with a sudden, primal fear. This was no ordinary desert storm. There was an intelligence to it, a focused, terrifying power. The wind escalated into a furious whirlwind, a vortex of sand and energy that seemed to connect heaven and earth. It descended upon them, not with the chaos of a natural disaster, but with the focused intent of a divine arrival. And from the very heart of that chaotic, thundering storm, a voice spoke. It was not the voice of a man. It was a sound that was both creation and destruction, a voice like the grinding of tectonic plates, the roar of a billion waterfalls, and the silent turning of galaxies all at once. It was a voice that vibrated in the very marrow of their bones, a power that commanded absolute attention. "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge?" The voice thundered from the storm, and the question was aimed directly at Job. It was not a gentle inquiry. It was a divine challenge, a command that stripped away all human pride and argument. Job, who had so desperately pleaded for an audience with God, who had longed to present his case, now found himself face to face with the Almighty, and he was rendered utterly speechless. His meticulously prepared legal defense, his righteous indignation, his profound questions, they all dissolved into nothing before this awesome presence. "Gird up your loins now like a man," the voice commanded, the words echoing with an authority that could not be questioned. "I will question you, and you shall answer me." The roles were instantly, terrifyingly reversed. Job, the plaintiff, had become the defendant. And God was not there to explain his actions. He was there to reveal Job's insignificance. "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" the Lord demanded. "Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements, surely you know. Or who stretched the measuring line upon it? On what were its foundations fastened, or who laid its cornerstone, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" Job could hardly breathe. The sheer scale of the question was crushing. He had worried about his small patch of land in Uz, and God was speaking of the very architecture of the planet. God was not explaining Job's suffering. He wasn't providing reasons or justifications. He was revealing the infinite, unbridgeable chasm between the mind of the Creator and the understanding of the creature. The divine interrogation continued, a torrent of questions designed to dismantle human arrogance. Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? when I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band? Have you ever in your life commanded the morning, or shown the dawn its place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth and shake the wicked out of it? Have you entered the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of the deepest darkness? Job felt his heart shrink within him. Every question was a revelation of his own profound ignorance. He had dared to question the justice of the being who set constellations in motion and held the oceans in the palm of his hand. God owed him no explanations. He was the creator, the sustainer, the very definition of reality. The entire universe, with its terrifying power and breathtaking beauty, depended on his will for its existence. For the first time, Job began to understand the most difficult truth of all. God is so infinitely greater than man that his ways are, and must be, beyond human comprehension. Job had demanded answers, but God offered perspective. He had demanded justice, but God offered majesty. And faced with the sheer, overwhelming weight of this glory, Job was left completely and utterly silenced. His hands, which he had raised to the heavens in defiance, now lay limp at his sides. His mouth, which had been so full of arguments, was dry and filled with dust. God spoke to him again, his voice softening slightly, but still holding an edge of divine authority. Will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him. An overwhelming weight within Job seemed to shatter. The pride, the anger, the need to be right, it all broke apart like a clay pot struck by a hammer. He had nothing left to say, nothing to argue, nothing to demand. Bowing low, pressing his face once more into the dust, he finally answered, his voice a broken, humbled whisper. Behold, I am vile. I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. I have spoken once, but I will not answer again. Yes, twice, but I will proceed no further. But the Lord was not finished. The lesson had to be driven deeper. Will you really discredit my justice? The voice continued, the question piercing Job's very soul. Will you condemn me just to vindicate yourself? A chill ran through Job's body. That was precisely what he had done. In his pain, he had wanted God to explain his suffering, to prove that he, Job, was innocent and that the system had somehow failed. But now he understood. God's justice did not need to be audited by a mortal. It was the standard by which all things were measured. God began to describe his creation in even greater, more terrifying detail. He spoke of the behemoth, a majestic, grass-eating beast he had made, with bones like bars of bronze and limbs like rods of iron, a creature of such strength that no one could tame it. He spoke of the Leviathan, the unconquerable monster of the sea, with its fearsome teeth and scales like a shield, a creature from whose mouth erupted fire and whose eyes shone like the rays of dawn. No one is so fierce that he dares to stir it up, God declared. Who then is he who can stand before me? If no one can face these creatures I have made, who then can challenge me, their maker? The point was devastatingly clear. If Job could not comprehend or control even these two creatures, how could he possibly presume to understand or judge their creator? Job could no longer hold back. The final walls of his self-righteousness crumbled into dust. He was not being punished, he was being humbled. He was not being condemned, he was being re-educated in the fundamental nature of reality. Bowing so low that he was prostrate on the ground, he confessed, his voice trembling not with fear, but with awe and repentance. I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. His voice was choked with emotion. I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Then he lifted his head, tears streaming down his face, washing away the dust and the grime. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, he confessed, but now my eye sees you. His heart had completely surrendered. Before, he had spoken without true understanding. He had questioned without seeing the vastness of God's glory. He had demanded a rational explanation for his pain. But God did not give him an answer. He gave him something infinitely greater. He gave him himself. He gave him his presence. And that was enough. Job, the man who had lost everything, now possessed the one thing that truly mattered. Not because his suffering had been explained, but because he had witnessed firsthand the awesome and terrifying glory of God. In that moment, he repented in dust and ashes, no longer a plaintiff demanding justice, but a humbled child standing in awe before his Father. The whirlwind subsided. The furious wind softened to a whisper and then fell silent. The dark, swirling clouds dissipated, revealing a sky washed clean, impossibly blue and serene. The divine presence remained, no longer a terrifying force, but a quiet, powerful stillness that permeated the very air. Job remained prostrate in the dust, his entire being recalibrated, his soul at peace for the first time since the storm of sorrows began. But the story was not over. The divine drama had one final act. God turned his gaze from his humbled servant to the three friends. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar stood frozen, their faces pale with terror. Throughout the long, agonizing debate, they had spoken with such confidence, so sure they were defending God's honor, so certain they understood his ways. Now, they stood utterly exposed in the light of his actual presence. The voice, no longer thundering from a storm, but speaking with a clear, unequivocal authority, addressed Eliphaz, the leader of the trio. "My wrath is kindled against you and your two friends," the Lord said, and his words carried the weight of a final judgment. "For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." The pronouncement was stunning, a complete reversal of their expectations. Job, the one who had screamed at the heavens, who had questioned God's justice, who had cursed his own existence, was the one who had spoken rightly. His raw, honest, desperate cries from the depths of his pain were more true, more real than all their polished, orthodox, and ultimately false theological pronouncements. They had tried to confine God within their neat, logical boxes, defending a caricature of him, while Job, in his agony, had engaged with the living, terrifying, and majestic reality. Job, the one who had suffered, the one who had cried out, was vindicated by God himself. His friends, the self-appointed prosecutors, were now in danger of judgment. "Now therefore," God instructed them, "take for yourselves 7 bulls and 7 rams, go to my servant Job, and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering." They were to bring the most valuable sacrifices, a sign of the gravity of their error. But God added a final, surprising, and humbling condition. "And my servant Job shall pray for you, for I will accept his prayer, that I may not deal with you according to your folly." The irony was profound and complete. Job, the man they had scorned as a sinner, the one they had judged and lectured, was now to be their mediator, their intercessor. Their salvation from God's wrath depended on the grace of the very man they had so grievously wounded. Humbled and trembling, the three friends did exactly as the Lord commanded. They gathered the finest animals and brought them to Job, their faces etched with shame and fear. And Job prayed for them. In his heart, where bitterness could have so easily taken root, there was now a vast, quiet space filled with a new kind of grace. There was no resentment, no "I told you so." He had seen God, and in that vision, all human offenses, all petty arguments, had shrunk to their proper, insignificant size. He prayed for the healing of the friends who had wounded him with their words, and as he did, as he chose forgiveness over grievance, something incredible happened. The Lord restored the fortunes of Job. It was as if the moment he released his friends from their debt, God released him from his trial. And he didn't just restore what Job had lost, he gave him back double. The friends and family who had abandoned him in his affliction now returned, not with judgment, but with comfort, bringing him pieces of silver and rings of gold. His livestock flourished once more, the numbers doubling. 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 she, donkeys. The Viridian Valley, once a place of ruin and sorrow, bloomed again with life and unimaginable prosperity. God didn't just restore Job, he multiplied him. But the most beautiful part of this restoration was yet to come. God blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the first. He gave him new children, 7 new sons and 3 new daughters. And these daughters were renowned throughout the land, for there were no women so beautiful in all the East. Their names were not just names, they were poetry, reflecting the beauty and blessing of this new chapter. He named the first Jemima, meaning dove, or radiant as the day, like the dawn after a long dark night. The second he named Keziah, the word for cassia bark, a fragrant spice, symbolizing a life of renewed purity and delight. And the third he named Keren Hapush, meaning horn of antimony, a cosmetic used to beautify the eyes, a symbol of new honor, splendor, and a restored vision. And in a radical departure from the customs of the time, Job gave his daughters an inheritance among their brothers, a sign of their preciousness in his eyes. The sun rose again over the land of Uz, illuminating fields that once lay in ruins, now teeming with life. Job, his body healed and his spirit whole, walked among his multiplied flocks, surrounded by the laughter of his new children, witnessing with his own eyes a redemption he never thought he would see again. Yet his greatest treasure was no longer his wealth, nor his livestock, nor even his beautifully restored family. His greatest treasure was his faith forged in fire, stronger than steel, more precious than gold. He now understood what was once beyond his grasp. God is sovereign. His justice is not measured by human standards, and his love is not reflected only in prosperity. His will is perfect, especially when man cannot comprehend it. Job no longer needed answers to the why of his suffering. He had received something far greater. He had seen the glory of God. That was enough. The man who once lamented his own existence now enjoyed a life blessed beyond measure. Years went by. Job lived for another 140 years, long enough to see his children, his grandchildren, and even his great-grandchildren to the 4th generation. He passed away as he had lived in his first and second lives, old and full of days, at peace with himself and with his God. In the end, Job's story was not truly about suffering. It was a story of redemption. Job never received the answers he sought. God did not explain the reason for his pain, nor did he reveal the celestial conversation with the accuser. But Job received something far more profound than an explanation. He received God. The Lord showed him the vastness of creation and the beautiful, terrifying smallness of man in the face of his glory. And in that moment, Job understood. He had heard of God by the hearing of the ear, but now he had seen him with the eye of his soul. This was his true ending, his real reward. Not the wealth, not the restoration of his family, but the transformative, life-altering vision of God himself. And so, the ancient question remains for each of us. In the starless night, when the foundations of our own small worlds are shaken, when the heavens seem silent, will we trust in the God we cannot see, the God we may not understand? Job's story doesn't give us an easy answer, but it offers a profound hope that on the other side of the whirlwind, a deeper, more real encounter with the divine awaits.